Hello everyone and welcome back. Welcome to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. Very pleased to be with you here for another week of wine tasting by structure. After 3 weeks discussing white wines, I'm pleased to move on now to red wines and a different approach a little bit. We're not going to be talking so much about acidity in these next 3 sessions. We're going to be talking a lot though about tannin. So I hope that's an interesting change for you. Welcome if you're watching on recording. Thank you for taking the time to do that. For those of you who are watching live, as ever, please use the questions function to submit your comments and your questions to me. Okay, so I think the good news for all of you guys who've been sitting through the last few weeks of discussing white wines is that we are now perhaps moving into territory which is a little easier to understand. I know very well that acidity and acid structure can be quite an abstract concept for a lot of people. It can be hard to wrap your head around the concepts, especially this thing about shape, the shape of the acidity. I know that's a hard one. But the good news is that I think tannin structure is a lot easier. So if you've been kind of having a hard time perhaps understanding all the things I was getting at in the white wines, then I think you're going to find the red wines a lot easier. I do at the top just want to make one comment. Many of you email me during the week and give me your feedback, and someone said something which I thought was very smart and worth repeating to everyone, which was that he said that he felt like when he first started attending the webinars, he was trying to imitate what I found in the wines. He was trying to get what I got, to try and discover the same things. But then he said he was actually a lot happier and he found it a lot easier when he just concentrated rather instead on the process. I'm quite obsessive in these seminars and these webinars about the process you're tasting for the level of the acidity you're taking, the type of the acidity, the shape of the acidity. The reason why I'm so detailed about those aspects is that's the process, I think, which will really guide you towards a better understanding of the overall sense of acid structure, for instance, in white wines. And so when we come on to the tannins in red wines, as you'll see, I've got a very similar approach to tannin structure. But again, maybe don't focus so much on what I'm getting, even though I'm going to still put up those slides saying this is what I think it's at, but focus on the process. Just think about the process, think about how you would find and ask the same kind of questions that I'm asking. And if you end up in the same place as me, great. But if you don't, that's also fine. But the great thing is you're training yourself to look out for these features. Okay, so I thought that was worth saying at the top. But let's move on to tannin structure in red wines. So tannin structure for me, well, let's just do tannin 101. Obviously, tannins are that drying sensation in your mouth, especially on the finish of the wine. Once you've spat or you've swallowed, you often feel like your mouth is drying out a little bit. Almost all red wines have got perceptible tannins. Clearly, some varieties show generally higher level of tannins than other varieties. And as always, there's many factors that come into play here. But in general, for the level of tannin, I think you're thinking about varieties. Again, I always like to use benchmarks. I think they can be helpful as reference points. So a variety in general, like Pinot Noir, would be on the lower end of the level of tannin spectrum. Whereas a variety like Nebbiolo or perhaps Cabernet that we're going to look at today would be on the higher end of that spectrum. So maybe think in your own head about what your benchmarks are for the level of tannin. So everyone, when they taste a red wine, will feel the tannins. They'll be able to feel roughly how strongly they are or not. But my argument about tannins is just like my argument about acidity. Not just that they are there, but they contain a lot more information than often we give them credit for. And if we just listen a bit harder and more carefully to the tannins, we might get to this position which I argue for in my book, Beyond Flavor, which is that just like important white grape varieties all have a slightly distinctive and individual acid structure. So all the major red varieties have got a slightly different tannin structure. And if you just focus on the tannin structure and ignore the flavors, you should still be able to identify the variety. That's my overall argument. And that should hold whatever the climate the variety is grown in, whether or not the variety is blended, whether or not it's seen oak or any other kind of winemaking. My argument is the tannin structure for Cabernet Sauvignon will always be the same wherever that Cabernet is grown in the world. So consistent across all types of regions and winemaking styles. So I already mentioned the level of tannin. That's always your starting point. And the simplest way of measuring that is how much does the wine dry out your mouth? Very simple. With red wines, I really take the same approach as white wines. I try and keep the wine in my mouth or my palate for about 5 seconds. That's definitely long enough to extract all the different compounds and the flavors and the textures and the tannins and everything else that's going on in the wine. So make sure you do that. The one thing I think is different though from white wines is that we generally found in white wines that we discovered most of the answers to the questions about acid structure during the time the wine was actually in our mouth. With tannins, we're going to have to listen a lot more carefully to what goes on after we've spat or after we've swallowed. So keep the wine in your mouth for about 5 seconds, not longer though, because it's going to kill your palate. It will just dry it out completely. But then make sure to listen very carefully to what's going on the finish. Okay, so level of tannin, we've talked about. How much does it dry out your mouth? The type of tannin. Now, this is where we get a bit more detailed, a bit more intricate. My argument here is just like it was for the type of acidity, not just that there are tannins in each red wine which dry out the mouth, but that we can be more specific about exactly what those tannins feel like, what their texture is in the mouth. So wherever in your mouth you feel that drying sensation most strongly, think about that place and think about what the exact texture of those tannins is. Because what I want to argue is that different varieties have got very different textures of tannin. So tannin is always a drying sensation, of course, that doesn't change. But within that overall category, there's different textures, which are going to change variety by variety. So level of tannin, type of tannin. And then the last one is the location of tannin. What this means is the physical place in your mouth where you feel the drying sensation of the tannins most strongly. Now, I do think this is one that seems easy enough, but you do have to work at it a little bit because we take it so much for granted that we feel tannins everywhere in our mouth. And that's true, we do. But I argue that there are some places where they feel particularly strong. And that's the place that we want to focus on. And once more, certain varieties have got the tannins felt most prominently, most strongly in one location over another. And if you learn those locations and you can begin to identify them consistently, you begin to understand your variety a lot more. That's my idea. Okay, so that's the context that we're going to be talking about. Tripartite approach to assessing tannin structure, just like the tripartite approach to assessing acid structure. And we'll do exactly what we did with the acidities in the white wines. We'll deal with each one, level, type, location, and then we'll pull them all together. And again, just as we saw in white wines, of course, there are many varieties with moderate or high levels of tannin, but then you can narrow it further by describing the texture of those tannins, and then even further by saying they're felt on the gums or on the tongue or wherever. And when you have all three of those categories in place, you've really narrowed down the list of possible varieties that you could be dealing with. Okay, so why don't we taste our first wine, which is the Merlot. Let's do what we always do with all our wines, which is just in order to psychologically get over flavor, we talk about flavors and aromas first, so then we can kind of move on and just assess structure. But our minds won't let us just do structure if we don't at least pay lip service to flavors and aromas. So please tell me what you're getting in your Merlot, and as you do that, please also tell me where your wine comes from, what region. I'm sure we've got a diversity of countries. Merlot grown in so many countries. Probably many of you will have had perhaps some difficulty finding a 100% Merlot. That's understandable. You don't see it as a single variety all so often, perhaps in California, a few other places, but maybe a lot more as a blend. So please tell me your aromas and flavors and where your wine comes from using the questions function. And I will read out what people are getting. Okay, here we go. Luciana has got a Saint-Emilion, probably a blended wine, but Saint-Emilion is almost always a majority of Merlot, so that's great. Kathleen is getting dark cherry, bramble, cloves, earth, savory, and plum notes. So it sounds like an interesting combination of fruit and savory there, Kathleen. Louise, wow, Louise's Merlot comes from the Loire. I don't think I've ever tasted a Merlot from the Loire. Dark cherry, smoke, and blackberry, says Louise, very good. And Corey, meanwhile, is in Pomerol. Of course, the ground zero for Merlot, really anywhere, I think. You can get quite close to 100% Merlot in Pomerol. I mean, of course, if you're Chateau Petrus, you can be 100% Merlot, but most other properties are at least a little bit Cabernet Franc. So a typical blend in Pomerol might be 80% Merlot, 20% Cabernet Franc, something like that. Whereas in Saint-Emilion, it might just be a touch lower. It might be 70% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc, and maybe some Cabernet Sauvignon as well. Okay. Let's see, Maria is saying that in her Saint-Emilion, vanilla and smoke, so maybe some oak notes, truffle, black fruits. I do think that truffle, i.e. a black truffle, I think, is a good note for Merlot wines, especially from Bordeaux. Perhaps in warmer climates, in California or elsewhere in the New World, you're going to get more focus just on pure fruitiness, red fruits and dark fruits. But I do think you get a lot of truffle and more savory notes, especially with even a little bit of age from the Bordeaux examples. Okay, very good. Why don't we, in that case, move on to tannins? So the first thing I want you to do is very simple. Just tell me the level of the tannin you get. How much does it dry your mouth out? And again, it will probably be helpful to think in terms of a benchmark. Does it have more or less tannin than a Pinot Noir or I don't know, a Nebbiolo or other major red varieties? It can be helpful to think in those terms. And again, this is the kind of one where you might want to really think about how dry your mouth feels after you've swallowed or after you've spat. Okay, so Kathleen is saying medium plus for her Saint-Emilion, which sounds right, good. Louise is saying moderate, very good. And Maria also is saying medium, excellent. Yeah, I think we're on the right lines here. I mean, clearly there are some very traditional style wines available from Pomerol and from Saint-Emilion, especially maybe some from Tuscany as well in the Super Tuscans, which are very big, concentrated, powerful wines which have got high levels of tannin. I mean, I think the most tannic wine in Pomerol is Chateau Trotanoir, for instance, made by the Moix family, who are quite kind of traditional style winemakers, which means they're not afraid of having quite a lot of tannin in their wines. I think that Trotanoir is probably the most tannic Pomerol that I know, and that one can certainly have high levels of tannin, but that may be more of an exception rather than a rule. Corey saying medium plus, very good. Okay, what about the type of tannin? Again, this is really a question about texture. So you can see I've thrown out some possible terms there. So just in terms of where you feel the tannin most acutely, just study that area with your mind and just think, what's the texture word that I could use, that I could apply an adjective which best describes the texture of those tannins. And really focus on the texture of that drying sensation rather than the texture of the fruit. That's a different thing, and that's something which we'll mention when we get to the next slide. The texture of the tannins is actually a very, very interesting component, and one that I enjoy thinking about. It can be quite hard to put your finger on it sometimes because there's lots of other things that can get in the way. The fruit can get in the way. In higher acid examples, the acidity can also get in the way. Oak obviously can. But you really want to just focus on where you feel the drying sensation most strongly and what it feels like there. Louise is going with sandy, Maria grainy, Kathleen smooth, and Corey velvety. Very good. So I do think sandy and grainy are quite close to each other. I do think they're sort of analogous to each other because sand is a grain, of course, and grainy to me indicates perhaps a slightly bigger grain, but still both in the same kind of category, I think. Whereas Kathleen and Corey are both going almost in the opposite direction, to say smooth and velvety, very seamless. Shengli is also going that way. Shengli has a Napa example, smooth or soft for Napa, Shengli says. So yeah, so there's quite a sort of division here, which is quite interesting. So we'll think about that in just a moment. And then Alice is saying for her example from Chile has got supple tannins at a moderate level. Supple means, to my mind, supple means not rigid, not too hard or tough, but certainly there, but kind of flexible. Quite a hard word to describe supple, but supple means, yeah, not too rigid, kind of flexible, but with a bit of give in them. Okay, and then the location of the tannins. Is there one place in your mouth where you feel those tannins more strongly than elsewhere? This one, to me, if you think about the comparable category in white wines with the acidity, this is where we start talking about shape in white wines, but in red wines, we're thinking about the physical place in your mouth where you feel those tannins most strongly. And I think that's a lot easier to get your head around. So what do you guys think? Louise is saying on the top of the gums. So maybe on the upper gums, you mean, Louise, above the top teeth. Yep, very good. And Kathleen says also on the gums at the front of the mouth. Yeah, because, you know, obvious point, but the gums do go all the way around your mouth. Wherever there's teeth, there's gums. But I think both Kathleen and Louise are saying really at the front, you feel them most strongly, perhaps on the upper gums at the front of your mouth. Okay, very good. Any other suggestions for location? I mean, right, there's sort of like a limited number of options in your mouth. There's only so many places in your mouth where you can feel these things. So that's good. And Kathleen's also saying perhaps you feel them on the lower mouth, but Luciano prefers to say on the upper gums and the tip of the tongue. So interesting. So I believe there is a connection between the upper gums and the tip of the tongue because both they're right at the beginning. When the wine first hits your palate, those are the first places that it hits. So that makes sense to me. Jeff is asking the perennial question, which we will ask many times during the next 3 sessions about the difference between oak and grape tannins. So let's just come on to that in just a sec, Jeff, if you don't mind waiting. Alice is saying upper gums, and also maybe a little in the cheeks. Okay, so let's see what I came up with my slide here. So I'm going to go with moderate level of tannins for Merlot. Yes, like I just said, there are examples, especially in France and maybe in places like Napa with long hang times where you can get high levels of tannin. But in general, I don't think the point of Merlot as a variety is to be a blockbuster in terms of tannin. I think moderate plus is fine. The type of tannin, so maybe I'll start with the last one of those three, grippy. Grippy simply meaning the tannins grip onto the gums. You feel they really cling on there. They kind of lock onto your gums, especially at the front of your mouth, as you can see for the location of the tannins. I agree with everyone who said on the gums, but I especially feel with Merlot that you get them on the front, around the sides as well, yes, but particularly present at the front, above the front teeth. And in that location, I think that's where you feel that grippy sensation perhaps most of all. Grippy, they just kind of seem to cling like a limpet to your gums. You can't shed them even if you want to. And that also, I suppose, is the connection with my other two adjectives for the type of tannin, sticky and clayey. Sticky meaning, again, they're sticking to your gums in a very physical kind of felt way. Clayey is a bit more complicated to explain for the non-English speakers among you. I made up this word from the word clay, as in clay soil, clay being a heavy soil. And sometimes the tannins do feel a bit kind of heavy in the way that they cling, they stick, they grip to your gums. And maybe it's not a coincidence that many of the world's great Merlots are in fact grown on clay, but that's not relevant. The point is that there's something which is very kind of sticky and gummy and grippy and clingy about Merlot tannins felt there on the gums. And Maria, I think Maria is saying that she understands clayey. Yeah, it's a very sort of physical sensation, I think, the clayey tannins. Let's just talk about that question about the oak that Jeff had, which is a very important question. And I'm glad to deal with it, the first wine of these red wine seminars, because it will be a recurrent question. So generally, what I think about oak tannins, so when a wine is aged in oak barrels, especially small oak barrels, especially new oak barrels, whether the wood comes from France or America or anywhere else, I generally think that, funnily enough, the place where you feel those tannins is actually just the same as we're experiencing in the Merlot. I think it is on the gums, perhaps more all around the gums, both top, bottom, and sides than Merlot, which might be a little bit more focused at the front, but certainly felt on the gums to give a very kind of a square sensation in the mouth. I think that's what oak tannins give. I think it depends on the quality of the oak and the use of oak, but sometimes the oak tannins can feel rather less smooth and slightly like splinters or even little pieces of wood just pricking into your gums there. When I experience that, then I'm never very happy, because I don't think that's a very nice use of oak. But in better examples, the tannins will actually adopt a very similar profile in terms of location and in terms of texture to what we have on this slide right here, with that kind of sticky sensation around the edge of the gums. Now, one of the things I would say is that this is a good moment to mention this point about the difference between the people who are talking about some kind of grain and the people who are talking about more smooth or velvety. So wood tannins would definitely go in the more grain category. So that means they feel just a little sandy, a little grainy, like you can feel like each individual grain in the wood, here. Like that's what wood tannin feels like. But in here, because of the sticky clay sensation, I agree that that they can be grainy, but Merlot does a pretty good job with that sticky claying sensation of overpowering the individual grains by a much broader sense of smooth and sort of effortlessly powerful tannins felt on the gums. So you don't, even though there is a certain grain to Merlot, I don't think that's the dominant note. I think the dominant note is rather this sort of general clayey, sticky sensation. So long story short, what that can mean if you have a very heavily oaked Merlot is that you can get the little grains of oak tannin over top of the sort of much longer and stickier sensation of the Merlot fruit tannins. It's quite an abstract concept. If you guys have never heard people talk about oak tannins before, or wood tannins, and just everything that I just said was right over your head, that's totally fine. We're dealing with very niche things here, particularly in the first wine that we're looking at with regard to tannin structure. But yeah, I generally in wood tannin just look out for slightly more evident graininess than you would get in Merlot normally. Okay, any other questions about Merlot before we move on? I should mention the other terms bullet point at the bottom here. So square, what I mean by square is, again, that's a reference to the tannins being felt on the gums. So yeah, they are felt on the top of the gums, the front, but also all around the gums. And that can give this sensation in Merlot that the tannins are like a frame around a picture. Like, because they're right around the edge of the mouth, they kind of frame everything that goes on in the middle. And what does go on in the middle? What goes on in the middle is fruit. Fruit is experienced on the tongue. And Merlot, of course, has always got this very generous mid-palate fruit that you experience on the tongue. So sometimes the tannins can feel like a square, like a picture frame with the fruit in the middle. And then the other thing I want to just mention with regard to that square is that it gives a very strong impression of being unmoving and unyielding. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to our white wine sessions and think about the Chardonnay, for instance. You guys will remember that I always talk about Chardonnay, the sort of linear, horizontal acidity with a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. And the very square tannins of Merlot around the edge of the mouth on the gums just seem to sit there heavy. And that effect is compounded by the concentration and the richness of Merlot's fruit, which it always has. And that too is not a fruit which has got a ton of energy or a ton of directionality to it. It just kind of sits there on the tongue. So the fruit sits on the tongue, the tannins sit there on the gums, and nothing really wants to move in Merlot. It just kind of hangs out. It's quite stolid. And that's why I call the whole sensation of Merlot on your palate kind of like unmoving, like the very opposite of Chardonnay and white wines. Now that finally brings me to the last point of the bullet points here, where I talk about two textures. Two textures is concepts I talk about in the book, which I apply to some, but not all red varieties. What two textures means is that the tannins in Merlot can sometimes have a different texture to what the fruit has. So we just talked about the difference in texture between oak tannins, which can feel quite grainy, like almost like splinters sometimes, and Merlot tannins, which can feel more sticky and clayey and more kind of rounded. Sometimes, however, especially for those of you who've got French examples, the Bordeaux people, perhaps, those tannins can often be a bit more grainy than you might get from Napa Valley, for instance, where the warmer climate just ensures that the tannins are a bit riper and softer. In somewhere like the Napa Valley, there will be a great similarity between the ripeness, the smooth, seamless ripe fruit, and the tannins, which seem to behave in the same way. But in places like Bordeaux, you can often get a situation where the elemental graininess of Merlot tannins sticks through the sticky, clayey, grippy sensation. So of course, being Merlot, even if it's from France, it still has that generous, supple, rich texture of fruit, very seamless, very smooth. But the tannins in France, in the French examples of Merlot, can be a bit grippy, a bit grainy, more grainy than New World examples. And when that happens, that's what I'm calling the two textures. The fruit has got one texture and the tannins have got another texture. Now you might think, well, that's a kind of obvious point. Don't all wines have that? Well, Not always. An example might be Pinot Noir, where the fruit has got a silky, velvety texture, and so do the tannins, and that's what makes it such a brilliant variety. I think good examples of Merlot will show less distinction, but you only have to have an underripe or lesser vintage of Bordeaux, where the Merlot tannins are quite grainy, and in unripe Bordeaux they can be quite stalky, even a bit green and stalky. And then you've got a big contrast with the fruit, which of course always remains smooth. So two textures. That's an idea that we're going to come back to. Okay, so I am watching the clock, and we took a little bit of time on that slide just because you know, it's the first wine, and I do want you guys to understand the concepts. Please shout if you don't, or anything I just said was not clear. But why don't we go ahead and pour the second wine now, the Cabernet Sauvignon. Interesting to stay in the same world. Many of you will be staying in Bordeaux for your examples. I love comparing Merlot and Cabernet tannins. It's just super fascinating. Let me just put the slide back here, just one sec. Okay, just so you can see the categories again. Shengli is asking, is Merlot fine grained? I don't really want to go into how fine the grain of Merlot tannins is. It will depend on the examples, but I do think that there is a general graininess underlying the grippy stickiness of Merlot tannins wherever the wine comes from, but especially evident in cooler climate examples. We're going to talk more about fine grained, what fine grained means a little later. But why don't you guys tell me what aromas and flavors you're getting from your Cabernet? And as you do that, please also tell me what region your example comes from. Of course, many possible options here for Cabernet. Any relatively warm climate can grow Cabernet. Okay, Louise is in Paso Robles, California, blackcurrant plums. Corey is in Hell Mountain, Napa Valley. Powerful style, often with quite powerful tannins from that mountain fruit in Napa Valley. Generally speaking, for people, maybe you guys who are watching this from Europe, maybe you don't get to taste so many examples of American wines over there. I know perhaps they can be hard to come by. In general, in the US, we make this distinction in Napa Valley between the fruit that is grown on the floor of the valley, which can be very rich and supple and ripe, and the tannins melt in your mouth. And then the wines which are grown on the slopes of the valley on either side, where the tannins can be a bit more powerful and rugged and structured, and they're not so seamlessly integrated into the fruit. Corey's example comes from the mountain. Okay, Kathleen Saint-Julien, delicious. I wish I was drinking Saint-Julien. Dark cherry, bramble, blackberry, plum, vanilla, earth, and cloves. Very good. Luciana is also in Bordeaux. Maria, also Saint-Julien, very good. Cedar and blackcurrant. Kathleen is enjoying her Saint-Julien, very good. I'm glad to hear it. Lynn is in Napa Valley as well, from Coombsville, which is a cooler part of the valley. Cassis, plum, black cherry, cedar. Very harmonious and well balanced. For Lynn, so that sounds delicious. Sounds like you got a good example there, Lynn. Okay, good. So let's talk about tannins and tannin structure. What's the level of tannin in your Cabernet Sauvignon? Who wants to have a go at that? Maria says without hesitation that her example has got high levels of tannin from Saint-Julien. Louise is going with moderate, but Kathleen is saying high also. So some high, some moderate. Corey is saying high for Howell Mountain, Napa Valley. Very good. And then why don't we think about the type of tannin or the texture of those tannins? What's a good word or a good adjective that you can come up with which best captures the sensation that those tannins give? And also it's quite good now that you have that benchmark in place of the Merlot So, you know, you've got to think about whatever adjective you use for the Merlot, the one that made most sense to you, whether it was sticky or clayey or grippy or more grainy for you, and just compare and contrast with the Cabernet. Lynn is saying very ripe and smooth, very good, from Coombsville, Napa Valley. Maybe polished as well, good. Louise, first it starts being smooth, but then sort of prickly from Paso Robles. Maria is saying polished and grainy, which might seem like a contradiction, but I think if you have a high quality grain, the grain itself can have almost a polished surface to it. So maybe that's what Maria is getting at. Kathleen is saying, Kathleen's really saying a very similar thing, that it's both smooth but also fine grained. Good. The way I think about grain, it's fine grained. We might as well have this conversation now, since we were just talking about what fine grained and grainy means. So generally speaking, you have to imagine, I think, something like sandpaper. You know, we sand something down with sandpaper or with a nail file or whatever, and it's the little humps, the little bits that stick up, which do the work, right? Now, if those little bits are quite big, and there's maybe a bit of a gap between each big one and the next one, which is quite big, then that would be sort of broad grained and not very tight. But fine grained to me indicates very, very small little bits that stick up, which are very close together. And so much so that sometimes you perceive the grain, but sometimes it almost seems like you're just floating across the surface. And the grain is of such a high quality because it's so small and so close together that you don't get down into the ridges between the grains. So that's why it can be in Cabernet Sauvignon, I completely agree with you guys, it can be both grainy in the sense of very fine and tight grained, but also polished at the same time, if that makes sense. So Kathleen's saying fine grained and Corey is saying pleasantly grainy, good. And then finally, what do you think about the location? Where do you feel these tannins? Yeah, again, I mean, I think the comparison with the sandpaper, you know, when you're sanding something down to make it smooth, I think is a very helpful one to think about when we're discussing Cabernet in this case, but also perhaps the Merlot that we just had. Lynn is saying spreads out over the back of the tongue, not that much on the gums, and a little alcohol felt in the cheeks. Maria is saying on the gums. Kathleen on the cheeks and at the back. Louise on the gums, both on the upper and the lower gums. Luciana saying on the front of the tongue and perhaps a little bit in the cheeks. And Corey saying the tannins are everywhere. I mean, I do think that this is an example of a wine. If you have a very big example of a Napa or maybe an Australian or maybe even a young Bordeaux, these can be very, very powerful tannic wines. And if any wine is going to feel like the tannins were everywhere, it might be a Cabernet. So if you get that sensation, then I don't disagree with you. Kathleen's saying she also feels the tannins on the gums. Okay, good. So why don't I see what I came up with? Okay, here we go. So yeah, I mean, the level of tannin with Cabernet is so dependent on both the growing region and the style of wine that you're trying to make. Cabernet being such a famous named variety, if you are someone who makes $7 wine or wine that's mostly sold in 3-liter bag-in boxes, then you're going to need a varietal Cabernet Sauvignon wine. But the people who are buying that kind of wine don't want high levels of tannin in their $7 wine. So in those Cabernets, they might have low to moderate levels of tannin. It's still Cabernet. So it depends very much on the style of the wine. But in general terms, from classic regions of origin, for the variety, I would expect at least moderate to high levels of tannin in the best examples. Type of tannin, fine grained. I think we've done that exhaustively. A very tight grain, meaning that you don't experience the dips between the grains so much, so you're just going to go right over the surface. And And that, I guess, is the essence also of what I'm saying about sleek. Sleek means it's a bit like linear and directional in Chardonnay. Sleek meaning there's nothing stopping it or slowing the experience of the tannins down. You're just going right along without much resistance. You're kind of floating right across the surface. Sleek. And then grippy. I mean, the example, the people who are in Napa, maybe the people who are in Bordeaux, I hope you know what I mean by the word grippy as you taste your wines. Again, a similar sensation to the Merlot tannins, where it just feels like the tannins are kind of locking onto your, in the parts of the mouth where you feel the tannins. Grippy, they've just got a strong grip, which of course will loosen with age as the tannins mellow. So maybe it's a contradiction to say that the tannins can both be sleek in the sense of floating along and also grippy, maybe. But I think it depends on the example that you have. But I think both of those facets are very common in Cabernet Sauvignon. I do agree that this is another gum wine, tannins felt on the gums, for sure. Again, like I just said, very powerful variety, so felt everywhere. But I think especially on the gums, just like Merlot. Now let's just go through these other terms, because the other terms part of Cabernet Sauvignon is really, it really gets to the heart of what Cabernet Sauvignon is all about as a variety. Directional. So if you remember one thing from this presentation, let it be this, which is that to me, Cabernet Sauvignon is the red wine equivalent to Chardonnay. What I mean by that is that Cabernet Sauvignon tannins behave in the same way that Chardonnay acidity does, which is they both push along the wine from beginning to end. The wine's got a very clear beginning, and it's always got a sense of direction, of energy, of purpose, and the wine really finishes strong. It's a wine that knows where it wants to go, and for sure it's going to get there. And remember, implicitly here, I'm drawing a contrast with the Merlot that I was just talking about, remember the stasis of the Merlot with the square tannins and the fruit on the mid palate just sitting there. This is the exact opposite. If Merlot is a static wine, then Cabernet Sauvignon is a directional wine, a linear wine. And why is that so? Well, because a lot of it is to do with the third term under other terms, which is horseshoe. Now, some of you will be familiar with this term, comparing the tannins in a Cabernet Sauvignon to the shape, the physical shape of a horseshoe. So you can imagine the front of the horseshoe is here, then it goes out around the hoof, and then it comes back in at the end, okay? And so that to me is like exactly like the tannins in a Cabernet, where they're felt around the gums, but then they come to a focal point on the finish. So they're felt particularly strongly at the front of the gums at the beginning, then they spread out around the gums, and they come to a focal point on the finish. And that also explains the next term, like an arrow. I've already talked about the directionality of Cabernet Sauvignon going somewhere, almost shooting along like an arrow, or for instance, like being on a road sign with an arrow, go this direction, because Cabernet is a directional wine. Like that's why I like the arrow. But that's not even the best use of the arrow terminology. An arrow, remember, think about an arrowhead. An arrowhead is like a triangle, right? So then this would be the base of the triangle would be the beginning, where it's broad across the front. And then the point of the arrow would be again on the finish. Really taste and see whether you can see what I mean by that. That both like the horseshoe, which is broad at the front and tapers to the finish, and like the arrowhead, which is broad at the bottom and goes to a point on the finish. That's what I'm arguing the tannins feel like in Cabernet Sauvignon, around the gums and coming to a point on the finish. See whether you taste that. Now, it's that shape, that horseshoe shape, that sense of always leading towards the finish, pointing like an arrow, like an arrowhead, tapering on the finish, That, I believe, is what gives Cabernet Sauvignon its sense of energy or its sense of purpose or drive. Again, contrast to Merlot, where the tannins are just square. They just kind of just sit there around your gums. They're not going anywhere, and nor is the fruit. But Cabernet is always on a journey somewhere, hence the silly image. And I also think, by the way, that the under the type or the texture of the tannins, that again, this is the fine-grained thing, the sleek thing, the sense that even though the tannins are grippy, the quality of the grain almost gives a sense of movement to the wine, because you can't get stuck in between the grains. They're so fine-grained, you just skate over the surface of them. So again, that energy. And then the final point I want to make about this is to do with acidity. Out of Merlot and Cabernet, Cabernet natively will retain its acidity a little bit better. And we know from all our discussions about acid structure in white wines that acidity is a key element in giving a sense of energy or direction to a white wine. And it does the same thing here with Cabernet. So Cabernet retains its acidity quite nicely. The acidity is a line of acidity from beginning to end. And then the tannins also have that sense of purpose because of the horseshoe or the arrow. So both the acidity and the tannins combine to give Cabernet a massive sense of movement or propulsion. From the moment the wine hits the front of your mouth as you first take a sip to when you've spat or swallowed, it's always going somewhere. One final point about that is the final point under other terms, which is this thing about the light mid palate. This is a bit controversial among winemakers of Cabernet Sauvignon, and so you should be aware of that. But many Cabernet Sauvignon wines around the world will have what seems to be a slight lack of fruit on the tongue, or what I call on the mid palate. So you go back to Merlot, and Merlot is maybe the best example anywhere of a wine with lots of fruit on the tongue. It's just an eminently fruity wine. You feel it right in the middle of the tongue, in the middle of the palate. And so in Merlot, the construction of the wine, like I said, is like the picture, the tannins being the picture frame, and then the fruit is the picture in the middle. In Cabernet Sauvignon, sometimes what happens is that you get the horseshoe around the gums, but you don't have the mid-palate fruit. Cabernet Sauvignon just doesn't have a generous fruitiness there that Merlot does. Now, the reason why that's a controversial thing to say in this world is because winemakers in warm climates like Napa Valley or parts of Australia or other regions can, in fact, generate enough mid-palate fruit that they can make 100% varietal Cabernet Sauvignon wines, and that's great. But it's still unusual. That's not the norm. The norm, as you guys know, in the Cabernet Sauvignon world is to blend with some Merlot. In Bordeaux, or even among the great Cru Classé of the left bank, it can be as much as 50% Merlot, even in a good year. A warm year, which you think would be good for Cabernet Sauvignon, estates in Saint-Julien, in Margaux, will often have up to 50% of Merlot. The first growths in Pauillac and further north, they can often have 90% of Cabernet Sauvignon. But note, it's not 100%. Even those estates which have got some of the best terroir in the world for Cabernet Sauvignon include 10% of Merlot. And I believe the reason for that is they just want to plump up that mid palate and give it a bit more generosity of fruit. So I think a super interesting contrast between Merlot and Cabernet. And let me go back to this conversation about the oak tannins before we wrap this up and move on to the final wine. Oak tannins, remember what I said, are not dissimilar in sensation to Merlot tannins. They're felt around the gums, all around the sides in quite a square sensation. But remember here, we're experiencing another wine in Cabernet Sauvignon where the tannins are also felt around the gums. And so maybe the absolute classic Bordeaux blend, especially from the left bank, is Cabernet dominant with a bit of Merlot. Or if you're in Saint-Emilion, like some of you just were, it's mostly Merlot with some Cabernet varieties. Maybe Cabernet Sauvignon, but more likely Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc really behaves in quite a similar way to Cabernet Sauvignon in the mouth. But either way, the point is you've got a Merlot Cabernet blend. Both of these varieties are tannins felt on the gums. And guess where oak tannins are felt? On the gums. So if there was any varieties in the world which would be well suited to being oaked, it would be Merlot and Cabernet. And guess what almost all red Bordeaux is? It's oaked. And the more I think about this, the more I think that there is an absolutely native connection between especially French oak with quite a fine grain, and then these Merlot Cabernet blends from Bordeaux, but not just from Bordeaux, but from Napa and other regions making premium expressions of Cabernet and Merlot around the world. Not just that it's a sort of winemaker's choice, oh, well, it seems like a good vessel, you know, it will gently oxygenate the wine, and maybe it's some new oak, maybe it will impart a little bit of flavor complexity as well, that kind of thing. No, I think the connection is much more profound than that between oak, especially French oak, and these two varieties, which is they give a similar shape in the mouth. They're almost made for each other. It's a very perfect match. The shape is the same, the texture, the grippy texture is the same. It's a very perfect blend, in addition to giving all those things that as a winemaker you want. You're fixing the color, you're settling the solids so you can rack it easier, you're giving a very gentle oxygenation, all those things that oak also gives to any red wine. So I remember, and this to me was so summed up so perfectly. I was in a taxi from Bordeaux airport to Saint-Emilion, and I was talking to the taxi driver. We were talking in French, and he said, oh, so you're in wine? I said, oh, yeah, yeah. And he said, well, what do you think about Bordeaux wines? And I was saying, yeah, I enjoy Bordeaux very much and all this. And he said, well, for me, he said, ce sont des vins de la terre et du bois, which means they're wines of the earth and of wood. And he didn't even mention fruit. He didn't mention the words Cabernet or Merlot or anything else. He just said they're wines of earth, which I think in a French lexicon means place. And then he said they're wines of wood, i.e. of oak. And to elevate, to me, when I heard him elevate oak to that status, I found that very, very interesting. That oak isn't just a sort of stylistic afterthought or a winemaker choice. It's absolutely fundamental to an understanding of how these varieties can most successfully express themselves. So I found that very interesting. Okay, any more questions about Cabernet or Merlot before we move on for our final wine, changing pace a little bit with the Malbec, which is going to be our last wine. So why don't we go ahead and pour that now, and you tell me where your examples come from, and tell me the flavors and the aromas that you're getting in your Malbec. Okay, let me just put it back on this slide. So, you know, I'm glad that Jeff was asking about oak tannins, because I think the absolutely best place to talk about the use of oak in red wines is in connection with Merlot and Cabernet. Those are two varieties which, to me, seem to suit the use of oak so extremely well because of a native similarity in texture and location of tannins. Okay, so let's see what you guys are getting. Okay, Malbec, aromas, flavors, and location for your wines, where they come from. Maria has an example from Mendoza, Argentina. Very good. And what aromas are you getting, Maria? Anyone else? Anyone have any French examples, any Cahors today, or are we all in Argentina? Lynn is in Mendoza also, with chocolate or mocha qualities. I love that. And blackberry also. Kathleen from the Lot in France, very good. Luciana also in Argentina from Catena, a classic example. Louise in Argentina is saying cedar, smoke, ash, plums, oil as in oil from the ground, that is, and black olives. Very good, sounds delicious, ladies. Kathleen, plums, blackberry, blueberry, so both black fruits and even some blue fruits from Kathleen, which is good. Joy is in Cahors, excellent, and so is Corey, so good to have that French origin as well in there. Smoke and vanilla for Kathleen. It's certainly quite a dark fruited wine, isn't it, Malbec? Whether you've got a French example or an Argentinian example. I mean, especially in Argentina. Certainly black fruits rather than red fruits. And then to me, even riper than black fruits is blue fruits. I think in ripeness terms, we go red fruit, black fruits, blue fruits. And some of you are getting some of that as well. Maybe a bit more red fruit in the Cahors examples. You guys with the Cahors, tell me whether you get any red fruits or whether you've also just got black fruits. Maria, herbal, blue fruit. Oh, Nisha's in Patagonia, an unusual location, quite a cool location for Malbec, but sappy plum and violets, very nice. And maybe a more floral expression. We'll come back to that. Maria saying her French example is Bretty, so a bit of barnyardy aromas and flavors in the French example. And Kathleen is noting that black fruits and licorice. Licorice, to me, is a classic note of ripeness. Not over ripeness, but just very ripe and quite concentrated. Often wines have got notes of licorice for sure. Okay, so let's talk about tannin. What's the level of tannin in your wine? Corey is just commenting that the Cahors that he has got black fruit. Kathleen's going with moderate plus for her Malbec. Louise is also saying moderate plus. Good. Maria is saying high. So no one's going lower than moderate plus right now. We've got some moderate pluses and we've got some highs. Lynn is also going with high but ripe, which is important because I think what ripe tannins means is that the tannins themselves have a slightly fruity quality rather than being really, really dry and austere, or very kind of tough and dry. That would be slightly unripe, but riper ones, they can still be powerful, but they taste a bit more fruity and soft. Luciana, medium plus tannins. And then what do you guys think about the texture or the type of the tannin? Luciana's going with smooth, good. Kathleen agrees with smooth. Louise is saying smooth but sticky. Lynn is saying smooth and polished, plush, good. And then finally, is there a place in your mouth where you feel these tannins most strongly? Again, this is a good example of a wine where after you've spat or after you've swallowed, you may want to really try and think carefully where you register those tannins most powerfully. It's quite hard to do that when the wine's still in your mouth, but after you've swallowed, then you might be able to detect that location a little bit more. Smooth, supple and sticky. Sticky, a bit like Merlot, perhaps, Joy. Very good. Nisha is saying hers are not smooth, they're grainy. Good. Maria is saying she feels the tannins in the cheeks. Nisha is saying gums. Kathleen saying teeth, gums, kind of like the horseshoe that we were just talking about. Liz is saying feels like a cheeky wine. Okay, good. Louise, the upper gums, perhaps a bit like the Merlot that we started with, and the Cabernet especially. Maria saying grainy. So perhaps another grainy wine, Maria is arguing. And Kathleen is saying on the upper gums. Very good. Okay, so let's see what I'm going to suggest. Okay, here we go. So, I mean, you know, to me, Malbec is a good example of a variety with, it's just very powerful. It's very concentrated, especially the Argentinian examples, but the tannins are very powerful. So I don't know whether you guys remember, but in a couple of the white wines, we were talking about the fact that acidity can be high, but it doesn't necessarily make it powerful. Here, but in some examples in acidity, the wine has got both high and powerful acidity, as opposed to, say, a wine like Riesling, which has got high but not necessarily powerful acidity. Here, I think in Malbec, you've both got high and powerful tannins. They make themselves felt very strongly. So I go with high, but again, it depends on the winemaking style. If you have a more mid-market wine selling for under $20 US, again, a consumer buying that kind of wine may not want to have high tannins, so maybe moderate is more like it. But I anywhere between moderate plus to high, certainly on the upper end, and in general terms, more tannin than Merlot, where we started with. Type of tannins, I see some words here which are familiar from what you guys have just said. Grainy, some of you guys certainly had that. Grippy, again, familiar to us from Merlot and from Cabernet, in fact. And I'm just going to throw one more extra one in there, which is coarse. Now, remember we talked about the fine-grained tannins of Cabernet that you can just kind of float across them because the grain is so discrete. I don't think that's the case with Malbec. Here, if in the graininess of Malbec, the grains are bigger and there's maybe a bit more peaks and troughs between them, so you can sense them more. So that doesn't give the same fine-grained, polished quality to the tannins of Malbec as it does to Cabernet. And so my term for that lack of high-quality, fine-grained texture is coarse. Now, maybe coarse is a bit negative, a bit pejorative. Maybe I'm being a bit too unfair on high-quality examples of Malbec, but many, many commercial Malbecs will have tannins which are powerful and just not that elegant, just quite brawny or rugged. I don't want to say rustic. Rustic is, there's nothing wrong with things being rustic, but just perhaps lacking the absolute polish and sophistication of Cabernet. Now let's think about location. Now, the location of the tannins, again, I think this is another gum tannin wine, just like the Merlot, just like the Cabernet. I think, again, we do feel these tannins very strongly on our gums. But, and here's the additional point that I feel particularly about Malbec, that we can qualify that location a bit further than just saying on the gums. Malbec to me is a wine that I always feel after I've swallowed, I feel the tannins on the jaw. And not just on the jaw, but on the hinge of the jaw, right here, right where the two bones connect. On the hinge of the jaw after you swallow is where I feel Malbec tannins. And that is certainly not a place where I experienced Merlot and Cabernet, which are much more on the gums. So I think that's a super interesting point about Malbec, which distinguishes it from the other varieties we've looked at today. Now, I mean, it's a kind of random question, but I suppose one way of looking at it is, do we want to experience tannins on the jaw just there? It's a kind of a bit of a random location. I do think if you look under other terms, my first term there is lockjaw. And what I mean by that is that the tannins can be felt so powerfully on the jaw in Malbec that if you leave the wine on your palate for too long, it can sort of jam up that hinge, almost to the point where you almost can't open your jaw. So it gives you this kind of lockjaw sensation because the tannins are so powerfully focused on the hinge of the jaw. So in that, I don't think that is, to me, that's not a sensation I particularly enjoy. It's not a sensation that you get with Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon. So maybe that is, I am being a little bit critical of it there. And Kathleen's saying a block of cement. So you can see what she's getting at. Jeff is saying, is that because most Malbec does not spend as much time in oak? I guess it depends on the wine. Maybe, so you, Jeff, do you think that the time in oak could perhaps smooth out those tannins? I think maybe it can give, certainly with a bit more gentle oxygenation, which happens during the time in oak, it can certainly soften out those tannins, but I don't think it could change the location of the tannins. That's the only thing. So the tannins may be a bit more tamed if they have an extended period in oak, but I'm not sure that the location of them would change. Lynn is saying, I get your sense of the jaw. I'm feeling lower cheeks, which is really the jaw if you think about it. Lynn, I'll come on to your next question in just a sec, but let me just finish these other terms before I forget. These sweet and savory and meaty are terms which are clearly not related so much to tannin structure. But I do want to mention them because I think that for me they're very they go right to the heart of what Malbec is as a variety. Sweet and savory. My idea about Malbec, and especially in Argentinian examples, is so that it starts sweet and finishes savory. Many Malbecs have a very unexpected red fruit quality on the nose, or an even floral quality. Someone said violets. And you kind of look at this deeply colored wine in your glass, and you taste it and you get those powerful tannins, and it can be unexpected to get some red fruits and floral notes on the nose. And you get that very powerful body, but then when you finish, Malbec has got this trick of finishing dry. So usually my kind of rather repetitive point about the difference between European wines and non-European wines is that non-European wines generally finish on fruit rather than being on some kind of savory or dry note. But Malbec from Argentina may be an example of one of the drier finishes of a red wine from outside Europe. And this is a little bit unexpected because, again, because of that concentrated ripe fruit, you would think that from a warm climate outside Europe, it would finish on that same fruit, but actually Malbec often finishes on a much drier note and often on a tobacco note, which of course is a dry note. So during the transition all the way from beginning to end of Malbec, you start on the floral notes, on the red fruits, on the palate you get the powerful black and blue fruits, and then on the finish you get that dry tobacco finish. So just an interesting transition because you don't usually expect to get those kind of all three different registers in the same wine. And I also wonder, I'm just speculating here, but my idea is that having all three things in one wine means that it's a kind of something for everyone variety, right? Like if you like drier wines, you could drink Malbec, but also if you like Napa Cab, you could drink Malbec because it's still got the dark concentrated fruit. So in that sense, I wonder whether one of the reasons why Malbec has conquered the world is because everyone can find something in it that they enjoy. The meaty note, by the way, I don't think I want to define it any further than that, other than say that Malbec can also be quite a meaty, bloody wine almost. Okay, so I've ticked off these points, so now I can deal with your questions. I apologize for keeping you waiting. Lynn says, can you say something about the relation of acidity to tannin? I'm noticing, especially with the Malbec, that the two seem to be in lockstep. I feel the acidity along the jaw with this wine as well. So one point I should have made very clear at the top is the obvious reason why I'm putting these three varieties together in this one webinar is because to me, they're all Bordeaux varieties. Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, obviously, but Malbec used to be heavily planted in Bordeaux and is still in a few places, but not so much now. These three Bordeaux varieties have a lot of things in common, which I'm going to come to when I show the final summing up slides in just a minute, but they also have some differences. And the differences, I think, are mostly to do with the movement, the sense of movement or not. So Cabernet Sauvignon, as my train illustration indicated, is clearly the wine with the most movement, right? Because of both the tannins, but as I mentioned, Lynn, the acidity as well. So you combine the two, you get a strong sense of movement. Merlot, lower levels of tannin and more static lower levels of acidity, excuse me, and more tannin structure makes a very stolid, rather static wine. But my idea about Malbec is that it's a kind of cross between the two. Clearly, it's got more mid-palate concentration of fruit than Cabernet does, and maybe even more than Merlot does. But it's got a bit more acidity and a bit more directional tannin than Merlot does. Of course, it doesn't have the high-quality, fine-grained, horseshoe-shaped tannins of Cabernet, but it's a bit closer to having a sense of movement, both from the tannins and from the acidity, than Merlot does. So it's kind of a cross between the two. So I think in that sense, that if you're saying that you find the acidity and the tannins go hand in hand in Malbec, then I wouldn't disagree with you. Corey is arguing for rustic for the tannins. Louise is saying the tannins are quite smooth on this Mendoza Malbec. Sure, that's totally fine, Louise, but look what I'm saying. I'm saying also grippy. I'd want to certainly stand up for grippy a lot more than grainy, because remember that long conversation we had in the Merlot about the difference between the clay and the grainy. The one thing that really came out of that, I think, is that whichever way you land, you're still going to have grippy tannins in Merlot, and I would say the same thing here. Winemakers can do all sorts of things with tannin management, but nonetheless, the quality of the tannin in terms of how it clings to the gums in Malbec, I think remains consistent, but totally fine if your example feels very, very smooth. Luciana making the point that her example makes dark chocolate taste sweet. So I guess that's a comment about the savory quality of Malbec. Okay, so let me just move on to the final slide, because I think there are some interesting comments that we can make about these three Bordeaux varieties. So all three varieties have got grippy tannins. They cling or they grip, and they don't just grip anywhere, they grip on the gums, all three of them. Movement or stasis, what I mean by that again is if you believe you've got a sort of grippy, sticky, clinging tannin, you're thinking I might be in a Bordeaux variety here with this wine, then one way of thinking about it is to say, is this wine moving like Cabernet, or is it static like Merlot, or is it somewhere in between like Malbec? And another way of posing a similar question is about whether you have a lot of fruit in the mid-palate like Merlot, or you have a deficit, a lack of fruit in the mid-palate like Cabernet. Now, in reality, it's not quite as easy as that, is it? Because most winemakers will blend Cabernet with some Merlot to round out, to fill that mid-palate a little bit. But you know, just some guidelines to think about. So I am quite fascinated by the subject of the Bordeaux varieties, because I think it's almost shocking that in spite of their quite different profiles in some respects, you know, about these last 2 points about the movement or stasis or about the fruit, nonetheless, the tannin structures are really quite consistent because of the first point here, the grippy tannins felt on the gums. And I find it fascinating that from ancestrally, at least, these varieties were all grown in the same place, and they have that similar profile, which, to go back to the oak point, is a very similar profile to what oak tannin does as it behaves in the mouth. Any final questions about any of the individual varieties or about all three put together? If not, I will leave you to ponder on all this. I would urge you to consider all three of these varieties together. I do think it's interesting to do that, and maybe also throw in there Cabernet Franc, which we didn't have time for today. Usually from the Loire Valley, a slightly lighter bodied wine from a cooler climate, as you would expect, but certainly I think a similar shape of tannin structure, excuse me, with tannins felt on the gums, and again lacking usually some mid-palate fruit. Okay, guys, that will be it for today. Same time next week, we are going to have what for me at least, because I'm playing to my preferences here, but it's going to be a super fun session on Pinot Noir, which we all love Pinot Noir, and then two great Italian varieties. So I think that'll be a lot of fun. Okay, see you guys same time next week. Thank you, everyone.